Welcome to the Kitsap Publishing Deep Dive podcast with myself, Jack Bennett, and Emily Waters. Join us as we explore books, current events, history, politics, health, and more. Let's dive in.
All right, so picture this. You're a journalist, and you've just gotten your hands on a press release about this really cool new economic development project by a local tribe. Sounds exciting, right? Definitely something you want to cover. But as you start looking into it, how do you make sure that you're approaching the whole thing with sensitivity? That you're being accurate and respectful in your reporting?
Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today. The Indian Country Stylebook.
I think we all have those style guides on our desk.
Right.
And they sometimes gather dust.
Exactly.
But this is one I think that you'll find yourself going back to again and again.
And I have a feeling this is going to be less about, like, where the commas go and more about,
Oh, absolutely.
yeah, a broader understanding.
This is about understanding the nuances of interacting with sovereign nations.
Nations, right, not
Just, communities or...
right here in Washington State.
It's easy to forget that. And Richard Walker, in the Style Book's foreword, he really lays it out saying, hey, the U.S. Constitution, it acknowledges these tribal nations, and the treaties that we have with them are just as important, just as valid as any international agreement.
It's a powerful reminder, isn't it?
It is.
That we're not talking about special interest groups here.
Yeah.
We're talking about sovereign entities with treaty rights that have real implications for how journalists do their work.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you come across this all the time in your reporting. Things like fishing rights, land management. These are all connected to those historical treaties.
He even uses this phrase, ceded lands and retained rights. What does that mean exactly for someone maybe like me who is just starting to report on this beat?
Well, it boils down to this. When treaties were signed, tribes didn't just disappear. They ceded some lands, yes, but they also very intentionally retained certain rights, often tied to essential things like resources and cultural practices. That's why understanding those historical agreements is so crucial for accurate reporting today. We're talking about lands that were once exclusively governed by these tribes, and those treaties still carry weight.
That makes a lot of sense. So this style book is really meant to be a guide to help journalists like myself navigate these nuances.
Exactly. It's about avoiding those missteps that come from not really understanding the context of Indian country and the unique nature of tribal sovereignty.
It's about asking the right questions and interacting respectfully.
Precisely.
So let's dive into some of those specifics. What are some of the terms that, maybe journalists like myself are getting wrong, and how does this style book steer us toward more accurate language?
Okay, so this might be a little embarrassing, but full disclosure, I feel like I've stumbled over the whole Indian versus Native American thing for years. I was kind of defaulted to Native American, assuming that was the more respectful choice.
Yeah, I think a lot of us are in the same boat. And the style book, it actually dives right into this whole debate, pointing out that Indian is still a term that's widely used, even by some national indigenous organizations.
Really? Okay, so it's not as simple as just...
Not a clear-cut case, no.
Yeah.
The guide acknowledges that complexity. I mean, let's be honest, the term itself is rooted in this historical misunderstanding. Columbus thought he'd landed in India.
Right. So it's inherently inaccurate. But at the same time, there are many indigenous people who use the term Indian and have reclaimed it as their own. So where does that leave us as journalists?
Well, I think the key takeaway here really is whenever possible, use the specific nation's name.
So instead of just saying, like, the tribe held a salmon ceremony, we would say the Lumi Nation held a salmon ceremony.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. It's more specific.
It's more precise, it's more respectful, and it reflects the diversity that exists within Indian country. Because we're not talking about a monolith, right? Each tribe has its own distinct history, culture, and even its own approach to these terms.
Absolutely. Now, something else that caught my eye in the style book was the distinction between gaming and gambling. And I'll be honest, I don't think I've always given that much thought. So why is this distinction so important? Yeah, it's easy to just default to gambling.
Right.
With all its connotations of casinos and luck and...
Right, like slot machines.
Exactly. But for many tribes, these are traditional games with deep cultural and spiritual significance that go way beyond that.
Oh, I see.
We're talking about games that are woven into ancient stories, spiritual beliefs, even ceremonies that have been passed down for generations. So using the term gambling kind of risks minimizing or even disrespecting that heritage.
So it's about really understanding the weight those terms carry?
Precisely. And this whole idea of being sensitive to language, it even extends to how we talk about history. For example, have you ever stopped to think about words like discover or explore?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially in the context of, Europeans discovering America, which of
Uh-huh.
course completely erases
Yeah.
the history that was already here.
It completely ignores the millennia of vibrant cultures that were already thriving.
Right.
So it's a subtle thing, but using explore instead of discover can make a world of difference because it acknowledges that indigenous people were here first and their perspective deserves to be centered in our storytelling.
It's like the style book is constantly reminding us. It's not just about getting the facts right. It's about understanding the impact our words have and honoring the lived experiences of indigenous communities.
Absolutely. And it goes beyond language, too. There's this whole other layer of respecting what we can and can't report on, especially when it comes to things like cultural events and artifacts.
Yeah, and there are entire sections dedicated to those topics. Regalia, songs, dances, stories. It made me wonder what makes those so different from any other cultural event I might be covering. I'll admit, I haven't always thought of these as being all that different from, say, covering a folklife festival or something.
Right. It's easy to see it that way.
Yeah.
But these aren't just performances or displays.
Okay.
They often carry deep spiritual meaning.
Right.
They're inherited, considered sacred. It's a completely different way of looking at things.
Yeah. There's a part in the style book where they're describing regalia, like what you see someone wearing at a powwow.
Yeah.
And they're very clear that this is not a costume.
Right. And that's such a crucial distinction.
It's a representation of family history, spiritual beliefs, maybe even a person's own individual journey.
It's almost like an autobiography in clothing.
Wow, yeah.
Right. So to call it a costume just completely misses the mark.
Yeah, it really does.
It's about so much more than just the visual aspect.
It really makes you think differently about how you approach, even just being present at these events as a journalist. So is it fair to say then that we're talking about cultural property here? Like, it's not always okay to just start snapping photos.
Exactly. And it's not always okay to share those photos publicly, even if you took them. And this is where, again, we have to remember that we're often interacting with a different jurisdiction.
Because tribal lands are
Right.
different.
Different laws apply.
So those open meeting laws that, I rely on all the time as a journalist, those don't.
They don't automatically carry over to tribal lands.
No. Yeah, that's something that the style book makes very clear. It says, Washington State's open meeting and public records laws, they don't apply to tribal governments.
And I think that that's something that a lot of journalists, especially those who are new to covering Indian country, they might not realize.
Yeah.
And it can lead to some real challenges if you're used to, those tight deadlines.
So that advice in the style book about starting early,
Oh, it's crucial.
getting information or permission might take longer.
Absolutely.
And that's okay.
It's about building relationships.
Yeah, it's respecting that process.
And the style book actually has some really helpful advice about how to do that. There's a whole section called etiquette in the Indian country.
Oh.
It's like a goldmine of information. Everything from requesting access to events to even being mindful of what you photograph.
It all kind of circles back to this idea of respect, doesn't it? Respecting sovereignty, respecting cultural property, respecting the way that information is shared.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this style book so valuable. It gives journalists, like yourself, the tools to do their job effectively and respectfully, because getting this right, it matters.
It does. It matters for the communities that we cover. It matters for our readers. And I think it matters for journalism as a whole.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I have to say, the Indian Country Stylebook, it's way more than just like commas and capitalization. It's really a guide to understanding, building relationships, and telling truthful, impactful stories about Indian country.
So the next time you're tackling a story that involves indigenous communities, take a moment. Think about what we've discussed and ask yourself, how can I approach this a little differently? How can I make sure that my reporting really reflects the nuance and the complexity, the resilience of these nations?
And don't forget that style book. It has a great directory of indigenous media sources right here in Washington State. So check them out, support their work. Let's all keep learning from one another. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to the Kitsap Publishing Deep Dive podcast. Emily Waters and I will see you in the next episode. Stay tuned.